Okay, we're in the sixth video of our Bible and literature study, and we're going to be going through kind of some texts, some literary texts that use the Bible as a reference and maybe theology as well. And some of these books are from your program that you've probably studied in the past or that you're studying now. It's important to understand really that as far as we can go back in English literature, we find the Bible, and in general, all the great authors of the past will have used it, or repurposed it, or referenced it, or something of that sort. And so, the first text I want us to look at is in Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein is interesting because the author, I mean Mary Shelley, and her husband Percy Shelley. They were romantics in terms of their literary kind of stream, but they were also not Christians. And so it's very interesting that I mean, they came from a Christian kind of world, because that was the 19th century kind of was like that in England, but they themselves kind of rejected a lot of that. And so it's interesting that she writes this story that has such clear references to the Bible. But in fact, when she refers to when the monster refers to the stories of the Bible, he actually is referring to Paradise Lost. And it's important to understand what Paradise Lost is. Paradise Lost is this epic poem, the kind of the great final epic of the great epics, of the great national epics. That it talks about the fall of Lucifer, the fall of Satan, his rebellion against God, and his temptation of Adam and Eve. So the story of Genesis 1 to 3, and then later on the whole kind of gospel is presented in kind of something that's going to happen in the future, is in Paradise Lost. So Frankenstein's monster reads Paradise Lost, and he is struck by the relationship between Adam and Eve, because they're basically these three little chapters of the beginning of the Bible are expanded into these kind of multiple books of poetry. And so he goes into the deep, loving relationship that Adam and Eve have, and how in Milton's version of Adam and Eve's story, Adam chooses to fall with Eve. Eve makes this terrible mistake. She disobeys God, but he actually chooses to fall with her, which is an interesting kind of reading of the text. But so Victor Frankenstein is this scientist who is kind of looking into this developing science and thinking, okay, there are things that we can do with science, and we can develop a lot, and we need to go further and go further and go further. And his aim is to be able to create life, right? So he is taking the position of God in some ways. And there's this text in chapter 3, which is his conversation with his professor. And the professor is talking about the new scientists, and he's saying, they ascend into the heavens. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of the fate announced to destroy me. So this professor gets Frankenstein thinking about ascending into the heavens. And this is a reference. It's a subtle reference, but it's quite a clear reference to two passages in the Bible. And the first one is in Isaiah 14. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation. I will, in the sides of the north, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Now, this is from the King James Bible. It's in the original Hebrew. It doesn't actually use Lucifer. I think it's a light bearer is what it means. So something to do with a shining light. So that we get the name Lucifer from that, but that's not actually the name of Satan in the name of Satan in the Bible. As I said in the previous video, Satan doesn't really have a name. He is the enemy. He's the adversary. He's the accuser. But we get this idea that this idea that comes out of some interpretations of Scripture that the snake, the serpent, was a great angel who falls from heaven. And he was called Lucifer, and then he becomes Satan. And so that's kind of a traditional way of seeing the story of Satan, which is not necessarily clear from the scriptures, but it can be pieced together from parts of scripture, depending on how we interpret them. This reference here, I mean, I can look it up quickly, but often in the books of the prophets, there are references to various kings in various places. There are references to the king of Tyre as being, so Tyre is a city, as being this person who wants to try and ascend in the book of Ezekiel as well. And so, but there is a traditional reading which kind of gives this to Lucifer. And then John 3:13 in the New Testament says, "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven." So it's talking about Jesus, Son of Man, which is in heaven. And so Frankenstein has this idea, this seed planted in his head, he could ascend to heaven. He could become like God. Now, I think we've seen in the story of Genesis this before, this idea that someone is giving him words, speaking words into him that make him dream about basically becoming like God. And yet the other text of John is basically telling us, watch out, this is only Jesus, the Son of Man, he's the only one who can actually ascend to heaven and come down from heaven, that he's the only one who can do these things. And so it tells us that something about the great, terrible thing that Frankenstein is doing. He is playing God. He is reaching up and trying to basically become a new creator, like God in Genesis. Now, the title of Frankenstein is the modern Prometheus, right? So that's a classical reference, not a Christian reference. Prometheus is a hero, right? He's this guy who brings down fire from heaven. But Frankenstein is a Prometheus, but in a villainous sense. He is maybe glorious, but he's glorious like Lucifer, right? And then there's this idea of fate, which is used here, the words of the fate. The fate is also a classical reference to these kind of goddesses that basically direct the fate of the life of someone. So we see a combination of these classical references, these biblical references. And so much as this whole series has been focused on the Bible, it's important to remember that actually you need to know also the classical references. It's important to read Ovid or read Homer and read these texts. But often I find that students have some knowledge of let's say the Olympians, maybe through Percy Jackson or other things like that, or maybe they've read some mythology when they're in primary school. But it's the whole biblical kind of background that is missing. So this is something that you can discuss with your teachers in IB about Frankenstein and what are the connections here. But the main idea is Prometheus or Lucifer, right? This kind of hero and villain are kind of embodied in Frankenstein himself, and he is someone who is basically trying to do something which only God can do, and because of that, he's going to do something terrible. But then there's also all the reference to how the monster wants his own Eve. He wants his own female companion, his own helpmeet, his own perfect match, because he's read Paradise Lost so much that he's convinced that is how he's going to be happy. That is how he's going to be pleased. And we can see in this the kind of reference to the fact that God brings to Adam all these animals. You say, can you see anything that looks like you that you might want to make your partner? And Adam obviously is like, no. Which creates in him this desire, this deep longing for a companion. And God is like, well, yeah, obviously these animals are not good enough. So he makes them fall asleep, and he creates he creates Eve out of him. But obviously, what Frankenstein decides to do is ultimately to destroy the female monster, because he realizes that it's too dangerous to have two of these that might actually end up procreating. That's for Frankenstein. I want to look at some other ones. So, for example, The Great Gatsby. We should teach this in year 9. Great Gatsby is a story of a man who is obsessed with wealth and being basically this amazing person who has all this money and who can throw all these parties and who can just show off and flex, as you guys would say, in order to impress the girl that he loves. And he lives kind of this lie of even himself, of the name that he gives himself, in fact. And the text tells us there are two very interesting two very interesting quotes from the book. The first one, which is it talks about how he becomes Jay Gatsby. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. So here it's a reference to the idea of Platonism, the idea that there is a truer version of things in the world of forms, or the world of ideas. So he imagines his true self, springs out of his own mind. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, it means just that. And he must be about his father's business. Now, this is actually a reference to something Jesus says. I'm about my father's business. But here, the Father is not God. The God that he serves is a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. Fitzgerald compares Jay Gatsby to Jesus Christ, but in a very obviously contrasting way. Jesus, Son of God, doing miracles, serving the poor, and all that, and he's faithful to his mission to the end. Jay Gatsby serves a different God, the God of wealth and beauty and excess, basically this excess of the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s, and he is faithful to the very end. And in fact, spoiler alert, so Gatsby dies. And he's shot by a man who thinks his wife cheated with. And you get at the end of this story this quote: "It was after we started transporting Gatsby's body towards the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete." And I remember teaching this, and my pupils thinking, "Oh, is this a reference to Nazi Germany or something like that?" But obviously, the problem with that is that this book was written 20 years before World War II. So what does it talk about? Well, the Holocaust it comes from its Greek word, which means a burnt offering, a whole burnt offering. And it's something which is done in the Bible. In the Old Testament, there are these sacrifices, these burnt offerings to God to basically satisfy his wrath, and to turn basically the pleasure of God towards those who sacrifice to him. And so this is a clear reference to the idea that Gatsby dies in service to his God, and his God requires sacrifice of him. Ultimately, this God of wealth and vulgarity requires him to die. And so it's saying something about the idolatrous nature of people's attraction to wealth and attraction to fame and to looking great, that it actually leads to death. We'll see that in Romeo and Juliet as well. Fitzgerald is really saying something about his own life. He lived in an age when the spirit of the age, money, glitz, glamour, parties, produced people who worship this lifestyle, and that worship ends up with human sacrifices. So as I said, he must be about his father's business is a quote from the Gospel of Luke. He would be the son of this God of vulgar, pointless, and unholy beauty. And just as Jesus must go to the cross, he must eventually die for his God. But at the same time, we see that there is someone else who's sacrificed to this God, and it's not just Gatsby. There's Wilson, this poor chap who basically, yeah, he dies as well. Other people have to be sacrificed to this God, people who are not guilty of anything, people who haven't haven't done anything but suffered because of it, and that's Wilson. So maybe Fitzgerald is making a deep theological point about how even his own lifestyle, his own world is deeply flawed, and maybe he has some kind of guilt for living in this lifestyle. There's interesting questions. You've probably studied Lord of the Flies. Well, Lord of the Flies, written by Golding. The title itself is a reference to the devil. The Lord of the Flies is a translation of the name Beelzebub, which is one of the names of the devil in the New Testament. There's also a reference to the beast of Revelation, the kind of the fears inside of the boys on the island. They're talking about the beast. There is a reference to Genesis. This island is this earthly paradise. And there's also reference to original sin, although that is not in the text, but it's in Golding's own words about the text. He's commenting on his book and the idea that where it came from, and he just they made it through World War II. And he says it is bad enough to say that so many Jews were exterminated in this way and that, so many people liquidated. Lovely, elegant word. But there were things done during that period from which I have still to avert my mind, lest I should be physically sick. They were done skillfully, coldly, by educated men, doctors, lawyers, by men with a tradition of civilization behind them, to beings of their own kind. My own conviction grew that what had happened was that men were putting the cart before the horse. They were looking at the system rather than the people. It seemed to me that man's capacity for greed, his innate cruelty and selfishness, was being hidden behind a kind of pair of belittled pants. I believed then that man was sick. Not exceptional man, but average man. I believed that the condition of man was to be a morally diseased creation, and the best job I could do at the time was to trace the connection between his diseased nature and the international mess he gets himself into. To many of you, this will seem trite, obvious, and familiar in theological terms. Man is a fallen being. He is gripped by original sin. His nature is sinful, and his state is perilous. I accept the theology, and I admit the triteness. But what is trite is true, and a truism can become more than a truism when it is a belief passionately held. In this text, Golding is saying that he believes in original sin, or at least that his story talks about original sin, that there is something wrong inside of us that we need to recognize, and that is the problem with the boys on the island, that they don't recognize that what they're doing is wrong because it's something inside of them. They think that they are good because they're British, and that's the problem. They think that their nationality will somehow preserve them from being bad, but actually they end up doing wrong because they think that they are free from problems. He says that you don't understand his point if you think that the boys on the island's problem was simply that they were outside of civilization, away from the adults, because the adults themselves, in fact, are fighting a war far away from the island. And the man who comes to save the boys in uniform looks good, but he is basically like Ralph wearing a uniform. And so the problem the kids have on the island is not an external beast, but it's an inner beast, which causes them to set up wicked systems, whether it's the tribe that they create or the empire. And that leads them to do wicked things to each other. So he's saying in this quote that if you look for an external answer to your problems, whether it's a group of people that are different from yours or the lack of education, you're missing the point, and you risk, once again, repeating history, that we have to look inside. We have to recognize what's wrong inside of us. So that's for kind of three novels that you've probably studied in the course of your studies. I wanted to just do a survey of other famous literature in the Bible. As I said, the oldest English text, which would still be called English, it's Old English, Cadman's Hymn, is the oldest poem in the English language. It's about the creation of the world by God. It's a kind of referring to Genesis. And then we get the story of Beowulf, which comes from the same kind of period, story written probably by a Christian monk. And in it, Grendel, this evil monster, is a descendant of Cain. And all these characters in the story seem to be monotheists, even though it's talking about this time of the Vikings. And the hero ultimately dies killing a dragon, allowing his people to be saved from its danger and rich because of the treasure that the dragon was defending, and his faithful follower gets kind of honor and glory because of that. And so this idea of the dragon slayer who dies, once again, this is something which comes out of the world of the Bible. The great epic poems of Europe, we get, Canterbury Tales, Paradise Lost, obviously Dante's Divine Comedy. These are filled with biblical and classical references, always constantly just kind of referring back to these things. And then we get, I've mentioned Paradise Lost, and the way it talks about the battle between angels and fallen angels, and it's kind of it's talking not only about things that happen in the Bible, but it's kind of philosophizing on various moral issues and theological questions. The whole story of the Bible is told to Adam and Eve at the end, saying, even though you fell, it's a good thing that you fell because all this wonderful stuff is going to happen later on. And so this is the idea of the fortunate fall, which is, again, a theological concept. John Bunyan, this Puritan, wrote The Pilgrim's Progress. It's one of the first English novels, and it was the most read book in the English language after the Bible for centuries as well. And it is filled with amazing imagery, pictures, beautiful kind of pictures, object lessons in there. And so you will always, you'll if you read these texts, you will need a Bible next to you to understand them. And it's the case for many books, as I've said. And of course, Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare is an interesting one because, as I said, Shakespeare and Greek myth are the other most quoted elements of English literature. But Shakespeare himself, who is constantly quoting the Bible and constantly quoting Greco-Roman stories, he is steeped in knowledge of the Bible, although he himself doesn't seem to comment clearly on religion in a direct fashion, or even quote the Bible in his writings directly. But his plays and poems are filled with religious references and with classical references. Here are some examples. In Hamlet, Hamlet goes to the University of Wittenberg, while Laertes goes to the Sorbonne, and he's pointing to the differences between characters, because Wittenberg is the University of Martin Luther, who's led the Reformation, and the Sorbonne is this Catholic university. Romeo and Juliet has many references to practice of praying to saints and to idolatry, this idea of worshipping statues. At one point, Juliet says, if you must swear by anything to me that you love me, swear by yourself, which is the God of my idolatry, and I will believe you. And that's a reference to one of the texts in the New Testament, which is talking about the fact that God cannot swear by anything higher than himself, and so he swears by himself. And so she is saying that Romeo is the highest, most important thing to her, and Shakespeare is pointing to the danger in this kind of mad love, which elevates people to the status of gods. And you can see, other references here to various characters in the Bible. The porter in Macbeth is drunk after Macbeth and people have had a party, and Macbeth has killed the king, and someone's knocking at the door, and he says, who's there in the name of Beelzebub? And he's basically saying, even though he's joking, he's saying, I'm the gatekeeper to hell, because Macbeth is transformed into a devil. The Claudius himself in Macbeth talks about, he makes a reference to the primal eldest curse, a brother's murder. He's referring to Genesis 4, the story of Cain and Abel. Richard III mentions Pilate washing his hands of something. How fain, like Pilate, would I wash my hands of this most grievous guilty murder done? Pilate washes his hands of Jesus's crucifixion, but obviously does not actually cleanse him from the guilt that he has. And so this idea of hand washing, that's a biblical reference. Ryken says about Shakespeare, multiple books have explored the biblical presence in Shakespeare, but the best known and definitive source is Nasib Shaheen's book, Biblical References in Shakespeare's Plays. Shaheen's tabulation ascribes approximately 1,200 biblical references in Shakespeare's plays, but he uses such a conservative grid that the total is almost certainly closer to 2,000. There are so many references in the first to the first four chapters, of Genesis in Shakespeare's plays that scholars commonly make comments to the effect that Shakespeare must have memorized those chapters. Shakespeare refers to 18 Old Testament books and 18 New Testament books. So really, I mean, you cannot really be a very good scholar of Shakespeare if you do not know the Bible. All right. And of course, beyond literature, for most of European history, even art was a religious matter. And many of the paintings and works that have marked the whole world are inspired from the Bible. And you can go and look at them if you walk through anywhere through Rome, Florence, or the Louvre Museum. You will see some of the most amazing paintings, and very, very often the work is a reference to the Bible. So those stories are worth studying so that you can actually enjoy, Rembrandt or Caravaggio or Michelangelo or Leonardo, all these amazing, amazing artists. But it's not just in the kind of the great kind of classical text that we would say, part of the canon. It's also in popular literature, which you would read, outside of the program, maybe. For example, Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. He says, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world. For the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. So he's literally saying, if you want to kind of understand the religious kind of background of the Lord of the Rings, you need to study its symbolism and all the swords and the healing and the characters that are there. Frodo at one point, for example, Gandalf dies and is resurrected, and he represents this divine providence. At one point, Frodo says to Gandalf, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides that of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you were also meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought. And this ring represents evil and temptation. It represents, once again, this temptation to do the forbidden thing. Gandalf is a manifestation of God's providence, and he's a Christ figure, dying and coming back more powerful than ever. Aragorn is also a great Christ figure. He's the head of a new mankind who has overcome the temptation of the ring. And when his great ancestor Isildur failed, as Christ is to Adam. Frodo is also a Christ figure. He carries the weight of the world's problems on his neck, on his back, and he goes up a mountain to bring the source of temptation and evil into the volcano, to destroy it at the cost of his life, even. And so all these elements should make us think. What is heroic in these stories? There's so much heroism, and it kind of all goes back to the figure of Christ. C.S. Lewis, Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia. There's so many biblical references constantly. Obviously, the main character that keeps coming back is Aslan, who is the lion, and he's a representation of Jesus. The Lion, of which the Wardrobe is a story about, the lion sacrificing himself to pay for the sin of Edmund. The Last Battle, the final book in the cycle of Narnia, is inspired by the Book of Revelation. And other books of Lewis. He wrote this book called The Pilgrim's Progress and Perilandra and The Great Divorce, and they're all rewritings of The Pilgrim's Progress and Paradise Lost and the Divine Comedy, which are once again these great texts of the Western canon, which are steeped in biblical references. If we go to Harry Potter, most popular book nowadays, the whole story is a story about the power of love and sacrifice, of the sacrifice of one person destroying the power of death. Voldemort, his name means someone who flies from death. He wields the power of death. He tries to escape death, But Harry survives death because his mother sacrificed herself for him, and then he saves everyone from the power of death by himself standing in front of his friends to die for them. And you get these verses on his parents' tombstone. And the last enemy that should be destroyed is death. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And so there are these references to destroying death, and so obviously destroying Voldemort, and to not look to the Hallows to save them, or to basically Voldemort has this kind of system of Horcruxes, and he's broken his heart up as well into all sorts of places. So Harry has to find his treasure in the people he loves in some ways. So I mean, this could be an interesting exercise for you to do, is to pick a work of fiction, whether it's a novel, a play, a film, and see if you can pick up any symbol, any plot element, any character type that comes from the Bible. Try and figure out how they're related. What is the significance? What are the differences with the symbol, biblical symbol, the biblical character? Or what is this biblical reference talking about? Does it connect? Does it work? These are all fun things to do when you start getting into the world of the Bible. In the final video, we're going to look at some other texts of the Bible, study a few texts of the Bible, and see how even the Bible uses these symbols so powerfully, to such a powerful effect, to tell stories, to challenge us into thinking deeper about the meaning of the text, and hopefully, I don't know, it will make you want to read some of it yourself. Thank you very much.